Hi everyone. I am recording this video in view of the fact that we are not able to meet in class today. So I hope that every one of you would be watching this because I would not be repeating this anymore if we're going to have our class next week. So we're looking at the sermon of Pastor Derek Parfan. It's entitled Paralyzed with Fear, and it is based on Genesis 32 to 33. I would, of course, recommend that you also read the section from chapter 31 all the way to 34, just to get a good overview of the section that he's trying to preach from. So anyway, we're looking at basically how he did this sermon. We already read the entire sermon, so we're now trying to look into the worksheets, and we've finished covering the exegesis worksheet. And if you have any questions about that, feel free to post them here in our group chat. So basically, he is explaining in the exegesis worksheets how he came to understand, the meaning of this section, chapter 32 verse 1 up to 33 verse 20. And of course he uses a paragraph in his answers to the worksheet questions. And for you, I would of course require just the bullet version. Okay, you don't need to use a paragraph version in answering these questions in the worksheets. But but help me to understand. Of course, I don't mean to say just write one word or something like that. But help me to understand what you're trying to say. So just in review, letter A is defining the literary unit. So basically, tell me how you came to decide on the section that you wish to preach on. And you can see the example here in the worksheet of Pastor Derek Parfan. And then letter B is essential historical and cultural or social setting of author and the original audience. So you will see there in Pastor Parfan's worksheet how he tried to understand the historical background and the context of this passage, and especially in view of the fact that they are about to enter the promised land. So please read through that so that you can get the feel of how he's able to come to that conclusion as to the relevance of this text. Notice, for example, in the last paragraph under B, he says, similarly, in the lives of Christians today, although we already received God's promised blessing or favor in Jesus, we are still prone to fear and anxieties. Bad circumstances or worries about the future easily overwhelm us and cause us to forget the promises of God and His presence to guide us every day. So you would notice, of course, there that he's trying to move even to the point of application as early at this point. Although you don't really have to, but that's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. Letter C is essential contextual themes. And basically, I'm just reviewing. We already talked about this in class. So we have two things under this essential contextual themes. Number one is connections and themes from passages before and after. And like I said, it would be good to really look into what transpired before this event and how those events probably inform or somehow affect how we are to understand this section. So look at the example that Pastor Derek Parfan did in his worksheet so that you can understand how it is done. Again, under that, we're still in point letter C. In number 2, it says implications of these connections or themes. So again, he's looking at what is the interpretation or implications of what he has observed in the text, especially the before and the after, passages, and so he's able to come to certain conclusions about what could be the possible meaning of this section. Now, letter D, we have essential story and structure elements of the narrative itself, and we have four things under that: narrative, historical, and social setting, narrative characters, narrative section or plot markers, and then narrative plot. So to understand each of those things, I would recommend that you read Pastor Parfan's answers and try to understand, what he was trying to do. So for number one, narrative, historical, and cultural setting, more or less, he has already done that in the previous sections, but here he's continually thinking about that, and basically that's the purpose of the worksheets, to prompt you to really think about these things. Number two would be the characters, narrative characters, and you would notice that he included God as one of the characters. You see that in the first sentence. The key characters in the story are Jacob, Esau, and God. Okay, so mostly or most of the time in Old Testament narratives, God is part of the story, although he may not be explicitly mentioned. So remember that. He's always part of the story, although he may not be explicitly mentioned. So we also have here the narrative section or the plot markers. Uh, what are the indicators that the story is moving? That's why here you would notice how he traces, Pastor Parfan traces the different movements in the story, which leads him to the number four, which is narrative plot. So the narrative plot would be the actual identification of how the story unfolded. Okay, and like I said, it has 6 parts: setting in action, conflict generated, suspense, climax, resolution, and then finally outcome. So looking at that, check it out and see how he was able to identify those narrative movements. Capital letter E, other clues to significance of narrative. There are two things here: direct statements by author or indirect statements through a character. And as I told you before in class, biblical narrators would often use the character as a way of communicating whatever theological meaning or implications he wants to communicate, usually via dialogue. And although sometimes the author himself might come into the story and actually talk to the reader. So be attentive to those details. Literary features, that's number two, signaling significance. And of course, Pastor Parfan identified the Hebrew word for face as something very significant in the story because it was repeated all throughout the story. And of course, as you well know, the narrative writer has to use these kinds of techniques in order to communicate. He does not have the usual conventions that we might have today, like bold letters maybe or underline. He doesn't have those things, but he can repeat certain words or themes to communicate that this is what he's trying to tell us. Okay. Now, letter F, essential theological themes. We have 3 things under that. Seeing God's face as his gracious favor, God's determination to show his grace, and then God's faithfulness to his promise to do good for his people. So these are the things that Pastor Parfan has identified as the essential theological themes in this narrative. So you would do the same thing. So of course, here he uses the bullet format, which is what I would like you to do. So basically, he identifies the different sections that show or reveal this theological theme. And then letter G would be essential timeless issues, life issues and principles. Here he's going forward perhaps to the possible implications of this passage and its theological meaning, and then applying it, uh, uh, you know, first in terms of Jesus, and how we are to understand the story in view of the Christological center or the Christ-centeredness of the Bible. And so we need to do that. We need to apply it to Israel, to the church, and so forth. So in this section, letter G, Pastor Parfan is already making attempts to try to apply the meaning of the passage. So study this, study the exegetical worksheet or exegesis worksheet, and try to figure out what is doing in each of these sections, and then you will be able to understand how you yourself can do the same thing. Now let's move on to the exposition worksheet. Here we have first of all the exegetical outline, and you would notice the difference immediately compared to studying epistolary materials like Paul's letters. So in the case of historical narrative, you would notice that the plot is the basis of the outline. So here he basically describes what each section is basically trying to say, or what the author is trying to say in each of the section. So for example, chapter 32 verse 1 to 8, he identifies that as conflict generated. And then he says, Jacob fears for his family when about to meet with Esau. So he's putting it all together, the context and everything, and he arrives at that description of that section, which pertains to the conflict that was being generated. Now, the exegetical idea here, he identified the subject as God graciously dealt with Jacob's fear of Esau, resulting in their favorable meeting. Now, like I told you, I do not subscribe to that way of identifying the theme. The theme is the general subject matter, and so it must be stated as a subject, not as a full idea. So as a subject, it can have an interrogative pronoun at the beginning, like for example, how God graciously dealt with Jacob's fear regarding Esau, okay, which resulted in their favorable meeting. So just adding the interrogative pronoun how will make it a subject. So the thrust is by affirming his blessing to Jacob after he prevailed in his striving with God. The reduced idea, which is 20 words or less, Jacob experienced God's grace in meeting Esau through the blessing that results from his striving with God. Or you can do, I don't know, you can do better maybe. But that's just the example, okay? Now, he moves on to the theological outline and idea. And once again, he uses, of course, the exegetical outline, but he unfolds the theological meaning for each of the section. For example, in 32:1-8, he says, Jacob fears meeting Esau, although God had previously told him to return to the land, and he will show his goodness to him. So here, Pastor Parfan is already identifying the theological idea within that section. And so you just trace it and see how he does it, and you'll be able to figure out how this is done. So theology of passage and theological idea. So there he says, God graciously deals with his people's fear and half-hearted faith by affirming his promised blessing through a struggle with God and with man. So what do you notice about that? Yeah, because you can see Jacob is no longer part of that statement. Neither Esau also. I mean, Pastor Derek Parfan, has now identified the universal idea behind the passage. Okay, so this is what exposition is all about. Trying to get the principle that is applicable to any generation. Now, for the author's life change purpose, He identified for each subsection terms of thinking and feeling and acting. So there you see, to teach Israel then when God promises blessing, no fear of anything or anyone should overtake him. So in terms of knowing or thinking, to move Israel to confidence in God, that is feeling, and then to motivate Israel to obey God's instructions without fear, etc. That would be acting. Now, the principalizing filter would be, of course, in relation to the present audience. So, first, he identified the life change needs. Now, I want to emphasize when we say need, we're talking about issues that the person first might be feeling or experiencing. That's why it's called real need. And then the felt need would be what people really need, even though they may not feel it, even though they may not be aware of it. Okay? So look at the example. For real need, to learn how to take hold of God's word, his promised blessings, even with the threats of man. So that's an example of a real need. People feel that, people experience that. Okay? However, the felt need, just to give an example, to overcome the fear of man and anxieties in light of a difficult present or future situation. In other words, that is what a person truly needs. Okay? So that's the difference between a real need, which a person might be conscious of, and the felt need. Oh, sorry, I think I got it the other way around. Sorry about that. The real need would be uh, those needs that are truly the need of a person, and whether he is conscious or not. And then the felt need would be those needs that they are actually conscious about or experiencing. So I got it in reverse. Sorry about that. Okay, so that's the other way around. So real need would be those needs that the Bible may be raising up or identifying, which the audience may not be aware of. And then the felt need would be those needs that they are aware of. Okay, like being afraid in a difficult situation. So life change purpose. Again, here he's already thinking about his audience. So once again, think differently, feel differently, act differently. And then, so you just look at those examples. And then functional question, he identified a why. All right. And like I told you, I think based on the subject matter, it's more of a how. But that's just me. Okay. We can all agree to disagree. As far as the homiletical idea is concerned, he said subject, there is no fear, there is no reason to fear. If this is a why question, then I would I would state the subject as why there is no reason to fear. All right? And then the complement, because God is zealous to bless his children. Or if it is a how kind of subject matter, I would say how to overcome fear, right? Well, by relying on God's promises, even in times of difficulty, maybe. All right? So it depends on what functional question we have identified. Now, looking at the homiletics worksheet now, again, please pay attention as I'm explaining these things because I will not be looking at this section anymore in our actual class. So, homiletical outline, introduction, overview of the cause of Esau's hatred and threat to kill Jacob, Jacob's 20-year stay in Haran, and God's command for him to go back to the promised land. Mention parallels to contemporary life and ask them why should we not fear any man or any situation when we think or feel there's really reason to fear. So basically, Pastor Parfan in this homiletical outline is beginning to think about how he would approach his sermon. Okay, so the introduction would be how he would be introducing the sermon. And then you would notice he follows basically the same exegetical and homiletical outline in the previous worksheet. But this time he applies it to the situation of his audience or even maybe collectively. So number one, just to give an example, in 32 verse 1 to 8, which according to the exegetical worksheet and exposition worksheet is where the conflict was originally generated. So he says this: we fear some people or some situation even when we know God's promise to always do what is good for us when we obey His will. So basically, this is the point that he will be stating in that section of his sermon. But if you read the sermon, going back to the sermon, you would see how he develops going into that idea. All right? So trace that and find out how he did that. And so forth and so on. So conclusion, God graciously deals with his people's fear and half-hearted faith by affirming his promised blessing through a realization of his presence. We do not have even a single valid reason to fear because God is zealous to bless his children. Now, of course, in the conclusion, as I have taught you elsewhere, that is where you are to mention your preaching idea or the main idea. All right. Now, the main idea. Let me see. Uh, the preaching, the homiletical idea. Oh, there you go. Okay, the homiletical idea, according to him, is there is no fear because God is zealous to bless His children. He does not really state that in the conclusion, but I would prefer that. Okay, I would prefer that you do that. That you actually emphasize the turning point. All right, preaching outline. So you would see in the narrative form, okay, we have four alternatives here, or four choices: alternating story, suspending the story, delaying the story, running the story. We'll talk more about that in our class. But he did not, he identified running the story rather. That was his option, running the story. So, introduction focus. He built the need by looking at his outline. He would relate first to contemporary audiences' needs, facing fear when obeying God's call or will. So look into the sermon, the manuscript of the sermon, and see how he did that. And then tell story of 32, 1 to 8, and weave point 1 of homiletical outline. Tell background of story why Jacob fears meeting Esau, and then question why should we not fear when we think or feel we have a valid reason to fear. So that would be the introduction there. And then tell story of 32, 9 to 21, and weave a point 2 of homiletical outline. Relate to audience's half-hearted faith in dealing with fears even when they knew they're obeying God. Question: with a half-hearted faith in dealing with our fears, are we now really ready to face the situation in which causes us to fear? So that's his basic introduction. Now the turn would be the climax of the sermon, where God is the hero and real needs are met as the story begins to bring us to God. So here he uses 32 verses 22 to 32. So look at it. Tell story of chapter 32 verses 22 to 32 and weave point 3 of the homiletical outline. Question: what will result once we realize His gracious presence and take hold by faith of His promised blessing? Then tell story of chapter 33 1 to 20 and weave point 4 of homiletical outline. Quote 33 verse 10. I've seen your face, which is like seeing the face of God. And 32:30, I've seen God face to face. So here is now basically putting his exegetical discoveries into the sermon itself. And I would like to just remind you that he's just telling the story. So he has chosen the option of just running the story. That was his option. Okay, that is the model that he's following. So basically, he's retelling the story, putting a modern, perhaps a face to it. But he's not reading the text. He's not reading it. So which means that probably it was read before. or is just referring to the section, and others are just reading it on their own. And then finally, the aim. So there are three sections in the sermon: the introduction, the turn, and then the aim. Okay, or the focus, the turn, and then the aim. So the aim would be the implications. All right. So relate to audience's need to have confidence in God's gracious presence in their lives and in dealing with their fears. Question: why should we not fear even when we face a difficult situation in our way to obeying the will of God? And so from there, he's going to introduce his preaching idea. Have no fear because of God's zeal to bless. Or God's zeal to bless drives out all our fears. Okay. And then there's the conclusion, which he did not state, and then the invitation or the action point, which he also did not state. Right. So basically, that's it. Those are the worksheets that Pastor Parfan uh, shared with us. And I would, of course, recommend again read the story, read the manuscript, and then go through the worksheets, constantly referring back to the manuscript to try to understand what is Pastor Parfan doing. What did he study, or what did he discover, and then how did he relate it back or use that information in his sermon. So look at the sermon, look at how he constructed it, and then find out how he came to that kind of realization or conclusion. So keep going back and forth. All right, keep going back and forth. So now concerning the passages that you are going to identify, may I request a little bit of, just like in the exegesis worksheet, if you may, all right? Just define the literary unit in a way that I can understand, all right? So don't just submit to me the passage or passages or chapters, chapters this and chapters that, but give me a short defense of why you believe that is the section that more or less you need to be preaching on. Okay, give me some understanding of what you discovered, why you thought that section actually is a preaching section. Okay, so we won't be going back to this. So if you have any questions, just feel free to ask them now, and I'll try to answer them. Hopefully, we can have our class by next Tuesday. But if things don't work out, then we will just try to adjust. So thank you so much, guys, and hope and pray that all is well with you. Please follow the instructions from the school. Don't go around. Just stay in your houses or rooms, whatever you call it, and stay safe. All right. So thank you so much, and God bless you.